June 18, 1945, 0630 hours. Limestone Cave Complex, Kian Peninsula, southern Okinawa. Sachiko Yamamoto pressed her 3-year-old son, Hiroshi, closer to her chest as the sound of American voices grew louder outside the cave entrance. Around her, in the stifling darkness, over 1,200 civilians sat in absolute silence. Grandparents, mothers with infants, children who had forgotten what sunlight looked like after 5 weeks underground. The cave system had become an underground city of the desperate. Families from 6 villages had fled here when the artillery barrages began in April, carrying whatever they could before American forces swept across southern Okinawa. Now they survived on rainwater collected in rusty pots and wild grass boiled over tiny fires that filled the caves with choking smoke. Outside, the voices continued. Not the harsh Japanese commands they expected, but foreign words that sounded almost gentle. Through interpreters, the Americans were calling for them to surrender, promising safety and food. But every adult in the cave knew better. The military police had been clear. Americans were demons who would torture and kill any Japanese they captured. For the 1,200 civilians hiding in Okinawa's limestone depths, emergence meant choosing between certain death underground and probable death in American hands, until they discovered that their enemies had come not as executioners, but as unlikely saviors offering chocolate to children and medical care to the dying. The Island of Suffering. Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, had become a charnel house where 300,000 civilians found themselves trapped between 2 armies fighting the bloodiest battle in Pacific history. The Japanese military had conscripted every able-bodied man, commandeered all food supplies, and driven families from their homes to make room for defensive positions. The island's unique geology had created a landscape of limestone caves and underground passages that stretched for miles beneath the surface. These natural formations, carved by centuries of water erosion, became shelters for civilians who had nowhere else to flee when the American invasion began on April 1st. As the fighting intensified, entire communities migrated underground. Villages that had existed for generations emptied as families carried their elderly relatives and youngest children into cave systems they hoped would protect them from the artillery barrages that turned the surface world into a moonscape of craters and smoke. The caves offered protection from bombing and artillery, but they also became death traps where disease, starvation, and despair killed as efficiently as any weapon. Families that had lived in wooden houses with gardens and clean water found themselves surviving like primitive humans in conditions that challenged the most basic requirements for life. The propaganda of terror. Japanese military authorities had spent months conditioning Okinawan civilians to fear capture more than death itself. Radio broadcasts, military announcements, and whispered stories painted Americans as subhuman monsters who tortured prisoners for entertainment and committed atrocities against any Japanese who fell into their hands. The propaganda campaign was systematic and thorough, designed to prevent civilians from surrendering even when continued resistance became impossible. Children learned songs about brave Japanese who chose death over the dishonor of capture. School lessons emphasized that Americans were racially inferior demons who showed no mercy to prisoners. Military police distributed weapons and explosives to civilian groups with instructions for mass suicide when American forces approached. Families were ordered to kill themselves rather than face capture, with grenades and other weapons provided specifically for this purpose when conventional resistance failed. The psychological conditioning was so complete that many civilians genuinely believed death was preferable to capture by forces that represented everything evil in their understanding of the world. The cave systems became not just physical shelters, but psychological fortresses where families prepared to die rather than submit to enemies they considered worse than death itself. The mathematics of desperation. The logistics of keeping 1,200 people alive in underground caves exceeded any reasonable calculation of survival. The limestone formations provided natural water collection points where rainwater accumulated in pools, but the water often became contaminated with human waste and debris from the surface battles. Food had been exhausted within the first 2 weeks of hiding. Families shared handfuls of rice until the grain was gone, then survived on whatever edible plants could be gathered during dangerous nighttime foraging expeditions. Children cried constantly from hunger until malnutrition made them too weak to express their suffering audibly. Sanitation was impossible in the confined spaces where families lived pressed together without privacy or adequate ventilation. Disease spread rapidly through the crowded cave system, with dysentery, pneumonia, and infected wounds killing people who had successfully avoided the fighting above ground. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. Without outside intervention, everyone in the cave would die within weeks. The only question was whether death would come from starvation, disease, or American discovery of their hiding place, the underground society. Despite the desperate conditions, the cave community had organized itself according to traditional social hierarchies that provided structure and maintained some semblance of human dignity during the crisis. Village elders made decisions about resource distribution and mediated disputes that could have torn the community apart. Respect for age and education remained strong even in the extremity of cave life. Former teachers organized lessons for children, trying to maintain some normalcy and prevent complete psychological breakdown among the youngest survivors. Traditional crafts were practiced when materials allowed, providing psychological anchors to pre-war life. Women shared childcare responsibilities and organized whatever medical care was possible with no supplies or trained personnel. Mothers who had lost their own children often cared for orphaned youngsters, creating extended families bound by shared suffering rather than blood relationships. The social organization that emerged in the caves represented both the best and worst of traditional Japanese culture. Cooperation and mutual support enabled survival that would have been impossible for individuals or small families, but rigid hierarchy also meant that resources were distributed according to status rather than need. The American approach. The 96th Infantry Division had been clearing cave systems throughout southern Okinawa for 2 months, discovering thousands of civilians hiding in underground complexes that honeycombed the limestone landscape. Each discovery presented tactical and humanitarian challenges that required careful handling to prevent tragic misunderstandings. Standard procedure called for using interpreters to call for surrender before employing force to clear caves that might contain enemy soldiers. The psychological conditioning of Japanese civilians meant that many chose suicide rather than surrender, creating heartbreaking scenes where families killed themselves rather than accept American protection. Lieutenant Colonel William Bradford commanded the battalion responsible for clearing the Kian Peninsula caves. His units had developed specialized techniques for handling civilian evacuations that emphasized patience, demonstration of good intentions, and immediate provision of food and medical care to convince terrified families that surrender meant survival rather than death. The Americans had learned through bitter experience that aggressive tactics increased civilian casualties, while patient negotiation often resulted in peaceful surrenders that saved lives on both sides. The discovery of large civilian populations required resources and procedures that went far beyond standard combat operations. The discovery. Early morning reconnaissance on June 18th revealed signs of large-scale human habitation in the cave complex. Multiple ventilation holes, paths worn by foot traffic, and the smell of cooking fires that indicated hundreds of people living underground. The discovery triggered protocols designed to maximize civilian survival while maintaining security against possible military resistance. Captain James Morrison led the interpreter team that approached the main cave entrance. His group included Sergeant Robert Yamamoto, a Nisei soldier whose fluent Japanese and understanding of cultural nuances made him invaluable for civilian contact operations. Their mission was establishing communication and assessing the situation before larger forces moved in. The initial contact was delicate and potentially deadly. Cave-dwelling civilians had been conditioned to expect death from American discovery, while American soldiers had learned that hidden Japanese positions often contained military personnel prepared to fight to the death. Misunderstandings could result in tragedy for everyone involved. "We could hear children crying inside," Morrison recalled decades later. "The sound echoed through the cave system like a symphony of suffering. We knew we weren't dealing with soldiers. This was a community that had been living underground for weeks or months." The first contact sergeant, Yamamoto, approached the cave entrance cautiously, calling out in Japanese that identified him as American military personnel, but emphasized peaceful intentions and offers of assistance. His voice carried clearly through the cave system, reaching families who had been expecting death, but hearing instead promises of safety and food. The response from inside the cave was initially silence, then whispered conversations in dialect that Yamamoto could partially understand. The civilians were debating whether the voices were genuine American offers or Japanese military police testing their loyalty through deception. The psychological barrier was enormous. These families had been conditioned to believe that Americans were literally demons who would torture and kill any Japanese they captured. The concept of American mercy was so foreign to their indoctrination that genuine offers of help seemed more likely to be traps than expressions of humanitarian concern. Yamamoto persisted for hours, repeating assurances of safety and describing the food, medical care, and protection that awaited anyone who chose to surrender. He spoke about American values that prioritized civilian welfare and international laws that protected non-combatants during military operations. "I talked until my voice was hoarse," Yamamoto testified. "I told them about my family in Hawaii, about how Americans treated Japanese civilians there, about the food and medicine waiting outside." Slowly, voices began responding from the darkness. The emergence begins. The first person to emerge from the cave was an elderly man named Takeshi Nakamura, who had been chosen by the community elders to test American intentions. His emergence represented an act of courage that could save his community or result in his immediate execution, depending on whether the promises from outside were genuine. Nakamura stepped into the sunlight expecting to die. Instead, he found himself surrounded by American soldiers who lowered their weapons and offered him water from their canteens. The gesture was simple but profound. Enemy soldiers sharing their own drinking water with a man they could have killed without consequence. Captain Morrison extended his hand in greeting, a gesture that Nakamura initially didn't understand. When Yamamoto explained that Americans shook hands as a sign of respect and friendship, the elderly Japanese man hesitantly participated in a cultural exchange that marked the beginning of trust between former enemies. "He was skin and bones," Morrison recalled, "obviously malnourished, probably dehydrated, but still maintaining his dignity. When he bowed to us and we bowed back, you could see the relief in his eyes. He understood that we weren't going to hurt him." The Great Emergence. Word of Nakamura's survival spread through the cave system like electricity, triggering discussions about whether his treatment represented genuine American policy or special circumstances that might not extend to larger groups. The decision to emerge en masse required consensus among families who were literally betting their lives on American promises. The emergence began slowly, with small groups testing American reactions before larger numbers followed. Mothers with children came first, reasoning that Americans might show mercy to families even if they killed adult men. Then came the elderly and sick, people who were dying anyway and had little to lose by trusting enemy promises. The stream of humanity emerging from the cave system overwhelmed American personnel who had expected to find dozens of civilians, but instead discovered an underground city of over 1,200 people. The logistics of processing, feeding, and providing medical care to such numbers required immediate improvisation and calls for additional resources. Each person emerging from the caves was assigned an American escort who provided immediate assistance, water, food, and basic medical assessment. The systematic kindness demonstrated that their treatment was policy rather than individual charity, helping convince remaining families that surrender was genuinely safe. The children's revelation. The children emerging from the caves created the most powerful psychological impact on both American soldiers and Japanese civilians. These youngsters had been underground so long that many had forgotten what sunlight felt like, while others had never experienced kindness from strangers who weren't family members. 3-year-old Hiroshi Yamamoto had been born just before the American invasion and had spent most of his conscious life in caves. When Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez offered him a chocolate bar, the child had no context for understanding what the brown square represented or why a foreign soldier would give him something sweet. The kid just stared at the chocolate, Rodriguez recalled. He'd probably never seen candy before, didn't know what to do with it, when he finally took a bite, and his face lit up with that smile. That moment made everything we'd been through worth it. The distribution of candy, chewing gum, and other treats to cave children created visible evidence of American intentions that transcended language barriers and cultural differences. Parents who watched enemy soldiers sharing food with their children began understanding that their captors possessed human emotions and cultural values that prioritized child welfare. The medical crisis. The physical condition of civilians emerging from the caves shocked American medical personnel who discovered evidence of systematic starvation, disease, and neglect that exceeded anything they had encountered during previous Pacific campaigns. Many people required immediate medical intervention to prevent death from malnutrition and dehydration. Army Medic Corporal Benjamin Chen had treated combat casualties throughout the Pacific War, but the cave civilians presented medical challenges that went beyond trauma surgery to include diseases and conditions that resulted from prolonged exposure to unsanitary living conditions and inadequate nutrition. They were like walking skeletons, Chen documented in his medical reports. Adults weighing maybe 80 pounds, children who looked like they were dying from starvation, old people with infections that should have been treated weeks earlier. We were looking at the results of people living like animals underground. The medical treatment provided to cave civilians became another demonstration of American humanitarian values that contradicted Japanese propaganda about enemy brutality. Professional medical care administered without regard for nationality or military status proved that Americans valued human life even when those lives belonged to enemy civilians. The food distribution. The systematic distribution of food to 1,200 hungry civilians required organizational capabilities that impressed Japanese observers familiar with their own military's chronic supply shortages. American logistics personnel established orderly distribution lines that ensured everyone received adequate nutrition without creating chaos or competition. The food itself represented abundance that most civilians had never experienced even during peacetime. K-rations containing canned meat, crackers, chocolate, and cigarettes provided more nutrition than many families had consumed during entire weeks underground. The casual generosity of sharing military rations with enemy civilians suggested resources beyond Japanese comprehension. Mess Sergeant Frank Kowalski supervised food preparation that included hot rice, soup, and other foods familiar to Japanese dietary preferences. The effort to provide culturally appropriate meals demonstrated respect for civilian traditions that exceeded minimum humanitarian requirements. "We cooked enough rice to feed a regiment," Kowalski recalled. "These people hadn't had a hot meal in weeks, maybe months. When they started eating, some of them cried. Grown men and women crying over a bowl of rice because they couldn't believe it was real." The cultural bridge. Language barriers between American personnel and Japanese civilians created opportunities for cultural exchange that went beyond immediate humanitarian assistance. Nisei interpreters like Sergeant Yamamoto served as bridges between cultures that had been portrayed as irreconcilably opposed. The presence of Japanese-American soldiers in American uniforms challenged civilian assumptions about American racial policies and treatment of ethnic minorities. Many cave dwellers had been told that America oppressed Japanese people. Yet here were Japanese faces speaking their language while wearing American uniforms and serving with obvious loyalty. Cultural sensitivity shown by American personnel, removing shoes before entering certain areas, bowing appropriately to elders, respecting family relationships, demonstrated understanding that contradicted propaganda about American cultural barbarism. These gestures helped establish trust that enabled continued cooperation. Simple acts of human courtesy, helping elderly people walk, carrying children who were too weak to stand, providing privacy for families during medical examinations, showed respect for human dignity that transcended national boundaries and military circumstances. The psychological transformation. The psychological adjustment required for civilians to accept American protection after months of conditioning to expect death challenged fundamental assumptions about enemy character and Japanese military propaganda. Many experienced cognitive dissonance that required weeks or months to resolve. Mrs. Keiko Tanaka, a teacher who had helped organize education for cave children, described her psychological journey. "Everything we had been told was wrong. Americans were supposed to be monsters, but they gave medicine to my sick daughter. They were supposed to kill us, but they saved our lives. I had to rebuild my understanding of the world." The transformation wasn't immediate or universal. Some civilians remained suspicious of American intentions for weeks after their rescue, expecting hidden cruelties or delayed punishment. Others adapted quickly to evidence that contradicted their previous beliefs about enemy character. Children adapted most readily to their new circumstances, often forming friendships with American soldiers who provided candy, taught simple English phrases, and demonstrated that foreigners could be kind and trustworthy. These relationships helped convince skeptical adults that American intentions were genuine. The educational revolution. American personnel established schools and educational programs for cave children who had been without formal education for months. The opportunity to learn in clean, safe environments with adequate supplies represented dramatic improvement over pre-war educational opportunities that most children had known. The curriculum included basic English language instruction alongside traditional Japanese subjects, giving children tools for communicating with American personnel while maintaining connection to their cultural heritage. The bicultural approach demonstrated respect for Japanese traditions that contradicted propaganda about American cultural imperialism. Teachers trained in American educational methods worked alongside Japanese educators to create programs that addressed both academic needs and psychological trauma resulting from months of cave life and exposure to combat. The comprehensive approach treated children as whole human beings rather than just students. Books, paper, pencils, and other school supplies were provided free of charge to students whose families had lost everything during the fighting. The casual abundance of educational materials suggested American wealth that could afford to invest in enemy children's futures. The medical recovery. Extended medical treatment for cave survivors revealed the full extent of damage caused by months of malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma. American military hospitals provided care that exceeded what many civilians had received, even during peacetime prosperity. The recovery process often took weeks or months as medical personnel addressed not just immediate health crises, but long-term damage from systematic deprivation. Nutritional rehabilitation proceeded slowly to prevent complications that could prove fatal to severely malnourished patients. Dental care provided to cave survivors included treatments that many had never received, despite obvious needs that had existed long before the war began. American military dentists provided professional services that demonstrated investment in civilian welfare that exceeded emergency humanitarian assistance. Psychological treatment for traumatized civilians included counseling approaches that were revolutionary by 1945 standards. American medical personnel recognized that emotional wounds required attention alongside physical injuries, providing therapy that helped families process their experiences constructively. The cultural exchange. Extended contact between American personnel and Japanese civilians created opportunities for cultural learning that helped both groups understand each other as individuals rather than enemy stereotypes. These exchanges often began with practical cooperation and expanded into genuine friendships. American soldiers learned about Japanese family traditions, religious practices, and social customs through daily interactions with civilians who were grateful for assistance and willing to share their cultural knowledge. This education helped Americans understand the depth and sophistication of Japanese civilization. Japanese civilians observed American cultural practices, informality between ranks, treatment of women, attitudes toward children that contradicted propaganda about democratic decadence and social chaos. Many were impressed by American efficiency and organization combined with genuine concern for individual welfare. Food sharing became a particularly important form of cultural exchange, with American cooks learning to prepare Japanese dishes while civilians experienced American foods that many found surprisingly appealing. These culinary bridges created common ground between cultures that had seemed irreconcilably different. The economic lessons. The abundance that American forces could afford to share with large numbers of enemy civilians provided object lessons in economic systems and industrial capacity that influenced Japanese understanding of democratic prosperity. The casual distribution of valuable resources demonstrated wealth that exceeded anything most civilians had experienced. Military supplies, food, medicine, and equipment flowed to civilian assistance programs with reliability that impressed Japanese observers familiar with chronic shortages that had characterized their wartime experience. The systematic abundance suggested economic capabilities that Japanese propaganda had denied or minimized. The efficiency of American supply systems, regular delivery schedules, quality control, variety of available goods, revealed organizational competence that exceeded Japanese military logistics even during the peak years of expansion. This evidence influenced post-war Japanese economic policies that emphasized industrial production and international trade. Japanese economists and government officials who observed American operations began understanding the industrial capacity that had enabled American victory. The demonstration of prosperity shared freely with former enemies became a model for rebuilding Japanese society along democratic and capitalist principles. The strategic impact. The successful rescue of 1,200 civilians from cave systems demonstrated American values and capabilities that influenced broader strategic objectives beyond immediate humanitarian concerns. The operation showed that American forces could provide security and assistance to large civilian populations during military operations. The psychological impact on remaining Japanese military personnel was significant, as word spread about American treatment of civilians who had chosen surrender over suicide. This information undermined propaganda about American brutality and encouraged other groups to consider surrender as a viable option. The rescue operation provided valuable intelligence about cave systems, civilian conditions, and Japanese defensive preparations that helped American forces plan future operations with greater sensitivity to civilian protection. The information gathered during humanitarian operations supported both military and political objectives. International observers who learned about the cave rescues gained evidence of American commitment to humanitarian principles that supported diplomatic efforts to build post-war alliances. The demonstration of mercy toward enemy civilians provided moral authority that enhanced American leadership during reconstruction efforts. The underground city's liberation. In the end, the discovery and rescue of 1,200 Japanese civilians hiding in Okinawan caves represented more than a humanitarian operation. It was a demonstration of democratic values under extreme stress that proved American strength lay not just in military capability, but in moral commitment to protecting human life, regardless of nationality. The families who had expected death and found salvation carried memories of American kindness that influenced their understanding of international relations for generations. Children who received chocolate from enemy soldiers grew up to become advocates for peaceful cooperation between former adversaries. The underground city that had been a tomb became a symbol of rebirth, where civilians who had lost hope discovered that enemies could become protectors, that mercy could triumph over vengeance, and that humanity could survive even in the deepest darkness of mechanized warfare. The cave rescue proved that in the midst of history's most devastating conflict, individual acts of compassion could transcend national boundaries and ideological differences, creating possibilities for healing that would bloom into decades of peace and friendship between nations that had fought with deadly determination just months before. For the 1,200 souls who emerged from limestone darkness into American light, the rescue represented their liberation not just from physical imprisonment, but from the hatred and fear that war had created. Their survival became proof that mercy was stronger than vengeance, that humanity could triumph over ideology, and that former enemies could find common ground in the simple recognition that every life was worth saving, regardless of the uniform it had worn or the flag it had served.